Good morning, welcome to Headline Focus here live on Core Politics with me, Rob Double. It is Thursday the 15th of March 2018. Let's have a look at what's making the political news today. So it starts with Cold War 2. Now this is the real story today. This is covering all the national papers. Indeed, we'll be covering the political agenda as well for most of the day as well. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, announced yesterday the expulsion of 23 undeclared intelligence officers from Russia. They had 1 week to leave the country after the Prime Minister alleged Moscow used chemical weapons in Salisbury, nerve agent, to kill their former, double agent, UK-Russian double agent, a few weeks ago. Now, the midnight deadline passed. The Prime Minister had initially set out a midnight deadline for Russia to explain what had happened in terms of how a nerve agent that they mainly create got into the hands of someone who then used it in the UK. That passed without the Russian government providing any kind of explanation, and as a result, the Prime Minister said the refusal meant there was no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attack on the ex-spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. Now, the UN Security Council, Britain's Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Jonathan Allen, said Russia had breached its obligations under the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the UK's position was backed by the US, and indeed France was as well hard in their position against Russia. Moscow said, however, it would retaliate, saying at the Security Council that Britain had failed to provide material proof that Moscow was responsible. And another interesting underlying story coming out today was the response of the opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. Now, he did say the incident was an appalling act of violence, but he questioned the evidence that Russia was behind the attempted assassination and even asked Theresa May whether the UK had provided Moscow with a sample of the nerve agent in order to validate the claims. Now, this happened at the same time that Jeremy Corbyn's spokesperson, Seamus Milne, was briefing journalists that there was a history in relation to weapons of mass destruction and intelligence, which is problematic, to put it mildly. And all of this is basically, a lot of the papers are saying, well, perhaps Jeremy Corbyn is providing some kind of excuse and isn't taking the hard line that the UK needs to against Russia. Now, the Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry and the Shadow Defence Secretary Nia Griffiths have both very much distanced themselves from Jeremy Corbyn's comments. Both have condemned Russia in terms of what's happened. And the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson as well today, just to be aware of, is pledging £50 million for a new chemical weapon defence centre at Porton Down. The speech is due to be about 11 o'clock today. But again, you can see here very much some underlying problems, particularly in the Labour Party, to do with Jeremy Corbyn's position versus several other senior members of his shadow cabinet. So keep a lookout on that one today. Next up, transition period is back on the agenda in terms of Brexit. Britain will accept EU demands for the transition period to be limited to 20 months rather than 2 years. David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, speaking on Newsnight last night, and he said his priority, the main priority, is to finalise a deal at the European Council meeting next week. Rather than worrying about the length of time of the transition period, it's more important to get that agreement in place. He also revealed plans to establish a joint committee of UK and EU officials during the transition period to uphold a duty of good faith by both parties, effectively that both parties are keeping the agreement sound during that transition period. Quite how that will work in practice hasn't been thought out yet or given any details of that through to the press, but no doubt we'll find out, particularly as the Council approaches. Now, one key concession is that Britain will be free to sign trade deals during the Brexit transition period without permission from the EU. Now, this is a big concession from Brussels. The UK has always said we want to sign our own trade deals. Brussels has said no, the transition period is very much a status quo arrangement, and therefore you're still bound to the EU signing trade deals as you are one of the 28 nations of the EU. That's a real concession. The reports are that was given as a quid pro quo that Theresa May would agree that freedom of movement can continue throughout the 20-month transition period. So effectively it's signing trade deals for freedom of movement. That's the trade-off there. We'll obviously have to wait until the European Council meeting to find out whether that is actually going to happen, but that's certainly the reports. And finally, one more story, this time from Europe. Angela Merkel is back in office and back in power. She's now Chancellor for the 4th time. Yesterday she was sworn in, and within hours she provided over her first cabinet meeting, and most of the ministers now all sorted and in place. 170 days after the Germans went to the polls, obviously there's been a massive amount of discussion over a coalition deal between Angela Merkel and the various other parties in the election. Now, the key thing here is that Angela Merkel is now in a position to get back involved into the debate about the future of Europe, specifically about the European Union and the reforms coming down the agenda. whether or not she's going to compete with, sort of cooperate with Emmanuel Macron over his plans to reform the European Union, or whether she forges a different path. That's the key thing now in terms of Brexit as well. How much will she now get back involved with foreign policy now she's sorted out what's happening at home? That's pretty much it for today. You're up to date. Don't forget you can find all the latest on what we're doing here on Core Politics on our Facebook page and Twitter right here. But from me and all the team here at Core London, have a fantastic start to your Wednesday.